Hey everyone, welcome back to the product briefing show of the Hun Club podcast. So today we will talk about Azure security nightmare, and we want to talk about non-human identities. My name is Tiff from product marketing, and today I'm joined by Aakash again from our product management team. Aakash, do you want to give everyone a quick intro again in case people haven't met you?
Yeah, I think people should go watch the last episode because I do a
Yeah.
deeper intro. But yeah, Aakash Gupta, product management at Vectra. I work closely on our cloud and identity coverage. So everything we do from an attack signal intelligence in cloud and identity falls under me. Very excited to be here.
Awesome. So let's start. My first question to you, Akash, is that so what are non-human identities in Azure? Tell us more about that.
Yeah. A crash course on identities is always helpful. So
Yes.
identities in Azure manifest in a few different ways. Fundamentally, every identity in Azure is associated with an Entra ID principle, Entra ID being Microsoft's identity provider. So within Entra, there's sort of two flavors of principles. The first is user principles, and second is service. User principles are what you'd expect them to be. This is me as a user taking an action. So Akash comes into the environment and does something. Service principles are the interesting one. They start to go
Mhm.
into the non-human identity realm. There's
Mm.
three different kinds. The first one is applications, which are the things that our folks are most familiar with, right? These are your like if you're deploying Vectra in your environment, Vectra would be an application. The second is
Mhm.
legacy. Not too much to be said here. Microsoft's working to sort of like get rid of this. And the third
Mm.
one is very interesting. It's managed identities in Azure. These are fundamentally identities that have managed credentials. As a user, you don't have to manage anything. Azure Cloud does the heavy lifting from a credential perspective for you. If you think about from a security lens, managed identities are actually very useful. They are less overhead and
Mm.
less management for security admins to do or cloud admins to do. And because a lot of the heavy lifting is done by Azure itself. Two
Mm-hmm.
different kinds here. User assigned MIs, which are user assigned managed identities, and system assigned managed identities that we'll dive into in like a second.
Yeah. And these are the headaches, right? The managed
Yeah,
identities. Tell us more about that.
for sure, yes. And from a from a user assigned and system assigned managed identities perspective, the use cases are slightly different. A user assigned is just that, is I create a managed identities for my resources to be able to use. So think about this as me getting or cordoning off an identity and letting my VMs use it or my service apps, app services, serverless functions use this identity within the environment. And it allows my resources a way to interact with the environment. So arguably, there are use cases where a bunch of resources form a functional unit. And as a system admin, I want them all to have an identity.
Mm.
The second is system assigned managed identities. These are a little bit more interesting where I, as a user, don't provision them. Azure creates them on my behalf. And so these are assigned to the specific resource that they are created with. And what happens is when you use system assigned managed identities, the identity is deleted if the resource is deleted. That's the really
Mm-hmm.
interesting thing. Without
Mm.
an identity, your resources are handicapped. So without, let's say, a managed identity, a virtual machine can't interact with anything on the control plane. That's what makes managed identities quite important.
Yeah. And it's the visibility too, right? Sometimes the security team don't even know that these non-human identities exist in their system. So let alone how can they monitor?
Absolutely. And that's what it does, right? It introduces these paths for an attacker to actually abuse these identities. So think about it this way. If I have a user assigned managed identity and I've given it a permission level of 7, let's say that's a spectrum out of 10, the resources that are using that assigned that managed identity may not need permissions of 7. Some may need permissions of 3, some may need permissions of 4. But what I've done is I've introduced a privilege gap in giving them that managed identity. And so what happens is oftentimes attackers come in and they leverage that gap and abuse privileges within the environment,
Hmm.
right? We've also often seen managed identities being used as a means to establish persistence, especially system assigned managed identities, because it's hard to keep track of these.
Yeah.
Evasion, if I take action on behalf of a managed identity and then I delete the resource, the identity
Mm.
disappears, right? So who do I
Hmm.
go talk to?
Mm.
So plenty of paths for folks to abuse managed identities. And what we've seen is these are actually very inadequately or not covered at all in a lot of
Mm.
native deployments in the Microsoft realm. Big
Yeah.
area for attackers to come in and abuse.
Yeah. And it's also even native solutions may have prevention like MFA for human identities. We know that it can't be applied to non-human identities. So it is even harder for defenders to know that these identities are abused.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. So my next question to you is then give us a little bit more details on how do attackers actually abuse these non-human identities, such as managed identities in Azure.
Yeah, we spoke about the paths that an attacker can take, right? So the usual techniques that are associated with non-human identities are privilege escalation, evasion, lateral movement, and persistence. And if you look at real-world attacks, an
Mm.
example being Blue Bleed, which was a data exfiltration attack, we've basically
Mm.
seen use of managed identities in the wild. These are oftentimes, especially user-assigned managed identities, can be orphaned in nature, and so for it, it's easy for an attacker to get access to these. We also often hear that, hey, these are credentials that are managed by Azure, so I should be protected because the security burden is on Microsoft. And that's partially right, right?
Mm.
What we see is if an attacker comes in and compromises the underlying VM itself, they've now got access to the managed identity, right? So it's not about just abusing the credentials themselves. If you're able to access the
Mm.
resource, you now are able to
Yeah.
use that managed identity to take action in the environment. So lots of different paths for attacker to come in here.
Yeah. And these identities are powerful too, right? As you said, they can access storage account where they can like get all the critical information. So very important. Then it
Yep.
brings me up to my next question then. How can defenders defend against these identity abuse?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've actually thought very deeply about this. And we often see folks try to model like simple rules. Tell me every time a managed identity is doing X in my environment. Unfortunately, what that leads to is a lot of alert noise in traditional enterprise scale environments. At Vectra, we sort of pioneered a fundamentally different way of looking at managed identities. And the way
Mm.
we do that is not looking at simple anomalies. We look at multi-dimensional analysis. So the first thing
Hmm.
we do is for each managed identity in the environment, we create a behavioral profile, understanding where the identity is coming from, where it's been, the resource provider, the IPs from which this identity is being accessed, and the type of managed identity, right? So it's this multi-dimensional analysis.
Yeah.
We then look at the environment, right?
Hmm.
We measure it against the baselines that we've seen for how managed identities interact with all resources in the environment. And then we start to
Mm.
factor in some of the additional context from the environment, like things like the subscriptions and the tenants, where we've seen these managed identities interact. And that allows us to come up with some contextual understanding of, is it expected for this managed
Mm.
identity to behave with this resource in this way in my environment?
Yeah.
And that allows us to, with very high fidelity, actually raise suspicion when we see an identity interact in a way that it's not supposed to, right?
Mm.
So it's this multivariate analysis that allows us to detect managed identities. Very hard to do if you're sort of modeling this in a tool like a sim, right? Where the dimensions you have to innovate on are limited. And so I have
Mm.
a proof point here from a customer where obviously firing a detection is one thing, but surfacing it is the other with clarity,
Mm.
right? So
Yes.
this is 10 million write events being taken in a customer environment over a period of 90 days. And in those 90 days, we've surfaced only 4 managed identities for review, which is
Yeah.
essentially saying that our methodology here is working. Right? We're able
Yeah.
to condense down the actions and then raise only what's most important.
Yeah, definitely. I think ultimately it's about finding the fine line between whether it's a user doing something new or attacker doing something bad. And the only way to do it is to use AI, as you said, like the multivariate like methodology to look at an identity to see the privilege and what it's actually doing. And to your point, we always emphasize it's not only about coverage, but clarity. We have AI triage, which filter a lot of the benign activities happening in the environment. We have another episode that we deeply talk about that, so I'll link it in the description box if you want to know more about our approach. AI stitching, how we talked about, we don't give people alphanumerical names, we stitch it to an actual account. And AI prioritization, like with the results that you just mentioned from these customers, prioritizing only four alerts for the defenders to go do something about, so that they don't need to figure out like all these false positive and they don't need to waste time on doing all of that, but we do it for them.
Yep. I think you hinted on something really interesting, which is different does not equal bad, right? On a single
Yes.
dimension, if I'm seeing an anomaly that is different, it could be bad, but oftentimes it's not, right? And we see
Yeah.
attackers try to blend in and behave benignly. So it's about looking at not one dimension, but a behavioral profile of the underlying entity, the managed identity, and then triggering on that. Different does not equal bad.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so I think it also helps to talk about the way we present some of this information, right? So you'll notice that on the top left, Tiff was alluding to human readable names, context. The raw Azure logs
Mm,
we get don't actually have these names, right? And so, like Tiff mentioned, we have to fundamentally enrich the raw logs and then bring in that information to present to an analyst. We also use this name to connect with all the other surfaces where we see this identity, right? So we connect to detections in Enter ID, detections in SaaS applications, Copilot usage in the environment. Through AD Connect, if this identity is interacting in your network environment, we're able to bring in all of those behaviors connected to this one identity and surface it with clarity,
yeah.
right? Across the board, detections have a lot more context, detailed descriptions, so that you don't have to be an expert in Azure to understand the detection, giving you
Yes.
immediate insights on what's most critical and how you would investigate and action this. Very, very interesting stuff. Um, the only other thing I'd highlight is directly from detections, if you use button B, investigate further, you're able to pivot to the raw logs, right? So we're able to take you from detections through the investigations workflow into the raw logs for you to do deeper investigations, enriched raw logs. So with things like human
Yes.
readable names, application names, lots of interesting stuff. The best way
Yeah.
to experience it is to try it. Like I think it's a game changer for SOC teams.
Yes, 100%. It's all about our approach in making security incidents explainable so that you don't need to spend additional time to go figure it out yourself, spend 25 minutes only to figure out something is false positive. With the investigation, we do have instant investigation, which gives you a quick guided pathway, tell you all the answers that you need. And as Akash said, also give you the ability to find the different logs, get access to them, gain access to them in a very easy way, so you get all the information you need to answer questions. All right. So with that, my three key takeaway from my conversation with you, Akash, is that first, it's very hard to gain comprehensive visibility, especially for non-human identities in Azure. And because attackers are just very good at blending in to normal machine identity behaviors. And the second takeaway that I have is that attackers are constantly targeting non-human identities because it is so difficult for defenders to monitor. They use these identities, and those are very high privilege as well. They can access important resources and data within an organization, and the attacker can use it for privilege escalation and lateral movement. The last takeaway is that defenders need to leverage AI, as we talked about the multivariate approach. And that's just only one approach that we have in developing models. There are many other approaches that we use as well. And that's the only way that we can find whether it's different or it's bad in a security environment.
Yeah,
Cool.
I could not have said it better. This is a really accurate summarization of the things we've spoken about. It's an increasing area of interest for us because again, like we've noticed that attackers are using it more, and it's
Yeah.
extremely hard to protect, especially this realm of identities in Azure cloud.
Yeah, 100%. And we don't only cover non-human identities in Azure. We cover non-human identities in all of the attack surface that we mentioned in network, Entra ID, M365, etc. And we continuously monitor them so that you don't need to worry about how attackers might abuse these very hard and often like painful identities that you need to go secure. With that, thank you so much again for joining me, Akash, and thank you for tuning in to this episode. If you haven't already, do give us a like, give us some comments, let us know your thought, and subscribe to our Hun Club podcast channel. We have loads more content coming up. And if you haven't already, also check out these two episodes that we have recently published. And yeah, let us know what you think. Thank you so much again for joining us and hope to see you in the next one. Bye.